I am Gemma, 33 years old. When I showed up to my brother's lavish birthday dinner at a Michelin star restaurant, my sister-in-law blocked my path, looked me up and down with absolute disgust, and pointed to a tiny table crammed next to the swinging kitchen doors. Only important guests sit with the adults today, Gemma, she smirked, handing me a stack of crayons. I stood there looking at the children screaming over spilled apple juice, realizing my family had not even bothered to set a plate for me. But as my brother popped another $500 bottle of champagne to impress his wealthy investors, he had no idea that the quiet sister he had just publicly humiliated was actually the CEO of the exact private equity firm he was desperately begging for a bailout. I turned around, tucked my gift into my purse, and smiled. "Then I'm leaving," I said. He froze. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth. The evening began in downtown Chicago at one of the most exclusive Michelin star restaurants in the city. It was my brother Jason's 35th birthday, and as usual, the event was designed to be a spectacle. Jason was the undisputed golden child of our family, a tech startup founder who loved to project the image of a billionaire visionary. Even though I knew for a fact his company was drowning in debt, I arrived exactly on time, dressed in a simple but elegant tailored navy suit. I drove an unassuming sedan and wore minimal jewelry, a personal choice that always drew the ire of my status-obsessed parents, Thomas and Diane. To them, I was just Gemma, the quiet, boring administrative assistant who never quite measured up to Jason's flashy lifestyle. They had no idea that I was actually the founder and CEO of Vanguard Equity, a highly successful firm I had built from the ground up entirely on my own. I kept my professional life strictly separate from my toxic family to protect my peace. The restaurant was breathtaking. All crystal chandeliers, velvet seating, and low ambient lighting that screamed old money. I spotted my family's party near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. It was a massive, beautifully decorated table set for 12. Jason was already there holding court in a custom Italian suit flanked by our beaming parents. As I approached the table with a wrapped gift in my hand, a solid investment check I had quietly prepared to help Jason out of his financial mess, my sister-in-law intercepted me. Naomi was a striking African-American woman who worked as a high-powered public relations director. She was fiercely ambitious, incredibly image-conscious, and had never bothered to hide her utter contempt for me. Tonight, she was wearing a designer gown that easily cost more than my first car, her hair and makeup flawlessly executed. She stepped directly into my path, her eyes raking over my understated suit with undisguised disdain. "You're late," she stated coldly, though I was perfectly on time. "I'm here to celebrate Jason," I replied calmly, trying to step past her. "Where should I sit?" Naomi shifted her weight, crossing her arms and blocking my way completely. "Actually, Gemma, there's been a slight change of plans. We had to make some seating adjustments." She gestured gracefully with one perfectly manicured hand toward the back of the dining room. "Your seat is over there." I followed her gaze. Tucked away in a dark corner right next to the noisy swinging doors of the kitchen was a small plastic-covered table. Four toddlers were already sitting there throwing pieces of bread and arguing loudly over a coloring book. It was the kids' table. I looked back at Naomi, certain she was making some sort of cruel joke. "Excuse me," Naomi offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Jason invited some very crucial angel investors tonight. We're trying to secure a massive round of funding to take his startup to the next level. We need the main table to look successful, dynamic, and cohesive. You understand, right? Only important guests sit with the adults today, Gemma. We can't have you bringing down the aesthetic while Jason is trying to close a multi-million-dollar deal." I stared at her, absorbing the sheer audacity of her words. She was explicitly telling me that my very presence was an embarrassment to their fake display of wealth. "So I'm supposed to sit with the toddlers at my own brother's birthday dinner. Someone needs to keep an eye on them anyway," Naomi said casually, turning her back on me to signal a waiter. "Just order whatever you want from the children's menu. It's cheaper anyway, and we all know you're on a tight budget." I walked over to the small table in the corner. The noise from the kitchen was deafening. Waiters rushed past, nearly clipping the back of my chair. I looked down at the table setting. There were plastic cups with lids, a pile of broken crayons, and a sticky menu. There was no dinner plate for me. There was no silverware. They hadn't even factored me into the head count for the meal. They literally just wanted me there as a free babysitter so they could perform for their wealthy guests without distraction. From my humiliating corner, I watched the main table. Jason was standing up, laughing loudly, clinking his crystal glass against the glass of a wealthy-looking man in a sharp suit. My parents, Thomas and Diane, were nodding along to whatever the investor was saying, practically glowing with pride. A waiter approached their table carrying 3 bottles of vintage champagne, the kind that cost at least $500 each. Jason signed the receipt with a flourish, playing the part of the triumphant tech mogul perfectly. They were spending money. They didn't have to impress people. They didn't know all while treating their own blood like absolute garbage. I sat there for exactly 3 minutes, feeling the familiar weight of their lifelong disrespect pressing down on my shoulders. I remembered how they had drained my college fund to bail out Jason's first failed business venture years ago. I remembered working 80-hour weeks and eating cheap noodles to build Vanguard equity while they celebrated Jason's mediocre milestones. But I wasn't that helpless 22-year-old girl anymore. I was a 33-year-old woman who commanded boardrooms and managed billions of dollars in assets. I didn't need to endure this disrespect for the sake of family harmony. I looked at the envelope in my hand. The check inside was meant to be a lifeline for Jason. I had noticed his company's desperate financial filings and wanted to help him quietly. I slid the envelope back into my purse. The sadness I expected to feel was entirely absent. Instead, a cold, sharp clarity washed over me. I stood up from the tiny plastic chair. I wasn't going to cry, and I was certainly not going to sit in a corner eating chicken nuggets while they paraded around pretending to be royalty. I smoothed down my tailored suit, took a deep breath, and prepared to deliver a reality check that would shatter their carefully constructed illusion of superiority. I watched Naomi lean in and whisper something to my mother, Diane. Diane glanced over her shoulder at me, frowned slightly at my plain suit, and quickly looked away as if acknowledging my existence would somehow infect her with mediocrity. My father, Thomas, was too busy laughing at Jason's jokes to even notice I was in the room. They had entirely written me off. The absolute disrespect wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate, calculated move to put me in my place. They needed a scapegoat to feel superior, a baseline of failure, to contrast with Jason's fake success. I buttoned my jacket, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of the Vanguard equity business cards in my inner pocket. The time for shrinking myself to fit their toxic narrative was officially over. I walked directly toward the center of the dining room. My heels clicked against the polished hardwood floor, a steady rhythmic sound that cut through the soft ambient music playing overhead. I didn't storm over. I didn't rush. I walked with the deliberate, measured pace of a woman who knew exactly how much power she held. As I approached the main table, Jason was mid-sentence, loudly boasting about his projected fourth-quarter earnings to a man wearing a custom suit and a watch that cost more than my parents' mortgage. The investor looked mildly amused, but Jason was sweating. I could see the desperate, frantic gleam in my brother's eyes. "Excuse me," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a sharp, cutting clarity that brought Jason's grand speech to a sudden halt. The wealthy investor paused with his champagne flute halfway to his mouth. My father, Thomas, immediately stiffened, his face flushing with severe irritation. My mother, Diane, grabbed her cloth napkin and squeezed it tight, shooting me a glare that practically screamed at me to vanish. "Why isn't there a seat for me at my own family's table?" I asked, directing the question to my parents. Diane let out an exasperated sigh, the kind of heavy, dramatic exhale she reserved exclusively for me whenever I dared to ask for basic human decency. She leaned sideways, lowering her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper. "Gemma, what on earth are you doing? Stop causing a scene. You always do this. You always make everything about yourself. Look at your brother. He's building an empire. The least you can do is support him quietly and not embarrass us in front of Jason's guests." I'm not causing a scene, Diane. I replied, my tone perfectly even. I'm simply asking a logical question. I was invited to a birthday dinner, yet I am standing here without a chair, while there is a perfectly good spot meant for me currently occupied by Naomi's designer handbag. Thomas slammed his hand down on the table, masking the aggressive gesture as a playful pat for the benefit of the investor sitting across from him. He gritted his teeth, forcing a stiff, unnatural smile. Go sit where you were told, Gemma. This is a very important night for your brother. Don't ruin this for him just because you need attention. We'll deal with your attitude later. I didn't flinch. I looked at Thomas, the man who had always treated my existence as a mild inconvenience to his perfect life. I don't need attention, Thomas. I need basic respect, the kind you freely hand out to absolute strangers while actively denying it to your own daughter. Jason finally intervened. He stood up, towering over me, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me into submission. He gave an awkward, apologetic laugh to his investor guest before turning his full, undisguised contempt onto me. Gemma, he sneered, keeping his voice low but dripping with malice. I'm trying to close a massive funding round tonight. My startup needs capital, serious capital. I'm sitting with people who manage multi-million-dollar portfolios. Do you know what these guys do? They build cities. They build the future. You push papers and file reports. If they ask what my sister does, what am I supposed to say? That you're a secretary? It kills my credibility. I need the vibe to be flawless. I need them to think my whole family is bred for success. I can't have you sitting here talking about whatever boring low-level clerical work you do. The vibe, I repeated, tasting the absolute absurdity of the word. Yes, the vibe. Jason snapped, his face turning red. These people are visionaries. They want to be surrounded by success, by energy, by wealth. No offense, Gemma, but you're none of those things. You're stagnant, you're ordinary. Having you sit next to me while I pitch the future of tech to venture capitalists makes me look bad. Just go sit with the kids, eat a free meal, and be quiet. Naomi leaned over, placing a manicured hand on Jason's arm, her eyes sparkling with malicious joy. Exactly, she added. I spent hours curating this guest list, Gemma. Every seat costs a fortune. We let you come because Diane begged us, but you're dragging down the room. We're operating at a different level tonight. We're talking about high-stakes investments, equity, and corporate scaling. Words you probably don't even understand. Just be a good sister and stay out of the way. We'll buy you a nice dessert later to make up for it. In the past, their combined assault would have crushed me. The old Gemma would have fought back tears, apologized for being a burden, and slinked back to the plastic children's table to swallow her pride. But standing there listening to them lecture me about high-stakes investments in equity, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating sense of detachment. It was mathematically hilarious. They were drowning in massive debt, desperately begging strangers for money, and lecturing the CEO of a private equity firm on how to behave around wealth. I remained completely rational. My heart rate didn't elevate. My hands didn't shake. I didn't raise my voice or offer an emotional defense. I simply looked at them, truly seeing the hollow, pathetic nature of their performance. I understand completely, I said. My voice was terrifyingly calm, stripping away all the emotional leverage they thought they had over me. You need to project an image of success because the reality of your situation is failure. You need a scapegoat to feel superior. I will no longer volunteer for that position. I reached into my tailored jacket, sliding my hand into the inner pocket. My fingers brushed against the thick, crisp envelope I had brought with me. Inside that envelope was a certified cashier's check for $100,000. I had spent the last 2 weeks quietly auditing Jason's company. I knew he was weeks away from missing payroll. I knew his suppliers were threatening legal action. I had prepared this birthday gift as a silent bailout, a gesture of goodwill to save my brother from total ruin without making him feel small. I pulled the envelope out. It was heavy, sealed with a wax stamp. Jason's eyes darted to it. He recognized the premium stationery, the kind usually reserved for the very financial institutions he was currently trying to court. For a split second, a flicker of genuine curiosity crossed his face. "What's that?" Jason asked, his arrogant mask slipping just a fraction. This, I said, holding the envelope up just enough for the light from the chandelier to catch the textured paper, was your birthday gift. It was the funding you're so desperately begging strangers for tonight. It was a lifeline. Naomi scoffed, rolling her eyes in exaggerated disbelief. Oh, please, what's in there? A $50 gift card to a coffee shop? Stop trying to act important, Gemma. I didn't respond to her. I kept my eyes locked on Jason. But you're right about one thing, Jason. We're operating at completely different levels. You're so obsessed with appearances that you failed to recognize the actual reality standing right in front of you. You don't want my presence at your table, and I no longer want a place in your life. I smoothly slid the envelope back into my pocket. The finality of the gesture made Thomas shift uncomfortably in his seat. He opened his mouth to scold me again, but I cut him off. Don't bother, Thomas. I'm leaving. Enjoy your evening. Enjoy your champagne. And Jason, I truly wish you the best of luck with your funding round. You're going to need it. I turned on my heel, presenting my back to them. I didn't wait for their reaction. I didn't storm off in a fit of rage. I walked away with the same measured, powerful stride I had used when I arrived. I was leaving behind their toxic dynamic forever. Every step I took toward the lobby felt like shedding a heavy, suffocating weight. I was no longer the family punching bag. I was the one holding all the cards, and they had just forced me to play my winning hand. Before I could even reach the edge of the dining room carpet, Jason called out. His voice was laced with that familiar grating arrogance loud enough for the adjacent tables to hear. Oh, come on, Gemma, he scoffed, projecting the image of an exasperated older brother dealing with a petulant child. If you're going to throw a tantrum and storm out, at least leave the envelope on the table. Don't make this about your ego. Just leave the gift and go cool off. Naomi chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy for the benefit of their wealthy investor guest. Let her go, Jason. She's clearly intimidated by this environment. It's overwhelming for her. I paused. I didn't rush back, and I certainly didn't raise my voice. I simply turned my head, locking eyes with my brother one last time. I let the silence stretch for a fraction of a second, ensuring every person at his table was paying absolute attention. You're right, Jason. I said, my words crisp and cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant. I'm not important enough for this table. I didn't wait to watch his smug satisfaction settle in. I turned forward and resumed my walk towards the grand foyer. My posture was flawless. I carried myself not as the defeated sister they wanted me to be, but as the apex predator of the financial world they were desperately trying to enter. The heavy velvet curtains separated the main dining area from the sprawling marble lobby, and as I crossed that threshold, the oppressive energy of my family vanished. The lobby of this particular Michelin star establishment was legendary in Chicago. It was a massive echoing chamber of white marble gold fixtures and towering floral arrangements. It was the place where billionaires shook hands and venture capitalists closed deals over scotch before even stepping foot in the dining room. I had practically lived in these types of rooms for the past 5 years, securing acquisitions and executing buyouts that shaped the city's skyline. As I approached the coat check, the evening shifted. I heard the sharp, urgent sound of leather dress shoes clicking rapidly across the marble floor. Miss Caldwell, please wait. I stopped and turned. Rushing toward me was Mr. Harrison, the general manager of the restaurant. Mr. Harrison was not just a manager, he was a legendary gatekeeper for Chicago's absolute elite. He knew every hedge fund manager, every real estate tycoon, and every tech billionaire in the state. Getting a table in his restaurant required months of waiting unless you were on his personal VIP list. I wasn't just on his list. My firm had quietly financed the expansion of his restaurant group 3 years ago. Mr. Harrison practically sprinted the last few yards, his usually perfectly composed demeanor replaced by frantic, genuine panic. He bypassed the host stand entirely, coming to a dead stop in front of me and giving a deep, respectful bow. Ms. Caldwell, I am so incredibly sorry, Mr. Harrison announced. His voice was robust, carrying effortlessly across the marble lobby and echoing straight through the open velvet curtains into the main dining room. I just saw your name flagged in our system, but the reservation was booked under a different party. I had absolutely no idea the CEO of Vanguard Equity was dining with us tonight. The lobby went dead silent. The hostesses froze. A couple waiting for their table stopped whispering, and most importantly, the clinking of glasses at Jason's table abruptly ceased. Mr. Harrison didn't lower his voice. He was in full damage control mode, eager to appease someone who managed billions in assets. This is completely unacceptable on my part. To have the founder of Vanguard Equity sitting in the general dining area is a catastrophic oversight by my staff. Please, Ms. Caldwell, allow me to rectify this immediately. The private tasting room in the wine cellar is open. We have the chef's special reserve ready. I will have your entire party move to the VIP suite right now entirely on the house. I stood perfectly still, letting his booming apology hang in the air. The words CEO of Vanguard Equity had echoed like a gunshot. I glanced past Mr. Harrison's shoulder. Through the parted velvet curtains, I had a clear line of sight to my family's table. The transformation was instantaneous and spectacular. Jason had half risen from his chair, his face entirely drained of color. He looked like all the air had been violently knocked out of his lungs, his jaw actually hung open. Naomi had dropped her phone on the table, her perfectly manicured hands frozen in midair, her eyes wide with a mixture of raw shock and sudden terrifying realization. Even my parents, Thomas and Diane, sat paralyzed, their expressions twisting from arrogant dismissal to utter bewilderment. Mr. Harrison looked horrified at my silence. Ms. Caldwell, please tell me my staff didn't disrespect you. If anyone made you feel unwelcome, I will handle it personally. Vanguard Equity is our most esteemed corporate partner. Your staff was wonderful, I reassured him smoothly, making sure my voice carried into the dining room. The issue lies entirely with the hosts of that table. They informed me that my administrative work was too boring for their high-stakes environment. They needed the seats for people who actually build the future. Mr. Harrison blinked, utterly dumbfounded. He looked past me toward Jason's table, his expression shifting from apologetic to deeply offended. He looked at Jason not as a valued customer, but as a foolish liability. Ms. Caldwell, that is the most absurd thing I have ever heard. You control more capital than anyone currently sitting in this building. But the most satisfying reaction belonged to the wealthy investor sitting across from my family. The man Jason had been trying to impress all night was now staring directly at me, his eyes wide with profound respect. He recognized my name. He recognized Vanguard Equity. He knew exactly who I was, and he now realized that the man begging him for a miserable seed round investment had just publicly humiliated the most powerful private equity player in the room. The investor suddenly stood up. He didn't look at Jason. He didn't look at my parents. He buttoned his suit jacket, picked up his briefcase, and completely ignored Jason's desperate, stammering attempts to get his attention. The investor walked directly toward the lobby, his eyes locked on me. The dominoes weren't just falling, they were accelerating, and my family was standing right in the impact zone. The investor stopped right in front of me. Up close, I could see the sharp, calculating intelligence in his eyes. He extended a hand. Ms. Caldwell. He said, his voice carrying the calm, absolute authority of a man who dealt in millions before breakfast. My name is Richard Vance. I've followed your work with the tech sector acquisitions last quarter. Brilliant strategy. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Mr. Vance, I replied, shaking his hand firmly. It's always a pleasure to meet someone who truly understands the market. He cast a brief, disgusted glance back at the velvet curtains separating us from the dining room. I had a meeting scheduled with that table over there tonight. I was led to believe I was dealing with a competent visionary founder. Clearly, I was mistaken. Anyone who can't recognize the value in their own boardroom, let alone their own family, is a terrible investment. He gave a curt, professional nod. I'll have my assistant reach out to your office this week. Have a wonderful evening. He walked out the front doors, taking Jason's entire financial future with him. The sound of shattering glass echoed violently from the main dining room. I looked past the curtains. Jason had jumped up so fast he'd knocked his heavy oak chair backward, sending one of those $500 bottles of champagne crashing to the hardwood floor. It smashed, sending a spray of expensive alcohol and white foam across Naomi's designer gown. She shrieked, jumping away, but Jason didn't even look at her. He scrambled. That was the only word for it. The confident, arrogant tech mogul was gone, replaced instantly by a desperate, panicked man. He shoved past a waiter, nearly slipping on the spilled champagne, and sprinted toward the lobby. "Gemma!" he yelled, his voice cracking loudly. "Gemma, wait!" He burst through the curtains. He was sweating profusely. His face was blotchy and pale, his eyes wide with a frantic, feverish terror. Naomi was right on his heels, clutching the stained fabric of her dress, her perfectly composed mask entirely shattered. Behind them in the dining room, Thomas and Diane had finally stood up, frozen like statues, staring at me as if they were looking at a ghost. Jason skidded to a halt a few feet away from me. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his custom suit. He looked at Mr. Harrison, then at me, desperately trying to process a reality that completely destroyed his worldview. "You," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are Vanguard Equity No, that's impossible. You're an admin. You file paperwork. You told Mom and Dad you do clerical work." "I never said I did clerical work, Jason," I corrected him smoothly. "I said I managed documents and oversaw operations. You and our parents simply assumed that meant I was an assistant, because you could never fathom me being more successful than you. You needed me to be small, so you could feel big. I just let you believe what you wanted to believe because correcting you was never worth my time." He ran a hand through his hair, messing up his perfect styling. He looked like he was about to physically vomit. The realization was hitting him like a freight train. For the past 6 months, he had been sending desperate emails, business plans, and pitch decks to Vanguard Equity. He had been begging my acquisition team for a bailout. He had been begging me. "Gemma, please," Jason choked out. His voice was a high, pathetic whine. He took a step closer, raising his hands in a pleading gesture. "You don't understand. My company, it's bleeding capital. The suppliers are threatening lawsuits. I'm entirely leveraged. I was trying to get Richard Vance to lead a seed round tonight, but he just walked out. Vanguard is my last hope. I have a pitch meeting with your senior partners tomorrow morning. You have to help me. We're family." I looked at him. I looked at the man who just 10 minutes ago told me I was too boring to sit at his table. I looked at Naomi, who had relegated me to a plastic chair by the kitchen doors because I ruined their aesthetic. "Family," I repeated. The word felt completely hollow. 10 minutes ago, you told me I dragged down your vibe. You told me I was stagnant and ordinary. Naomi said I belonged with the toddlers. You were perfectly happy to humiliate me when you thought I had nothing to offer. But now that you realize I hold the keys to your financial survival, suddenly we're blood again." Naomi pushed past Jason. Her voice was trembling, stripped of all its usual venom. "Gemma, please. We were joking. It was just a misunderstanding about the seating arrangement. We were stressed about the investor. You know how much pressure Jason is under. Don't do this. Don't mix business with a silly family argument." I turned my gaze to Naomi. The coldness in my eyes made her physically step back. "This isn't a family argument, Naomi. This is a corporate assessment. And my assessment is that your husband is a fraudulent leader running a failing company, and you are an accomplice in burning through capital for the sake of appearances. I don't invest in liabilities." I turned back to Jason. He was shaking his head, tears actually pooling in his eyes. "Gemma, please just let me pitch tomorrow. Just look at the numbers. If Vanguard doesn't inject capital by Friday, I lose everything. The company, the house, the cars, everything." I looked him dead in the eye. I held his desperate gaze for 3 agonizing seconds, letting him feel the absolute weight of his actions. "Yes, Jason," I said softly. "I know you have a pitch meeting scheduled with Vanguard Equity tomorrow morning, and I just canceled it." He let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. His knees visibly buckled, and Naomi had to grab his arm to keep him from collapsing onto the marble floor. Through the curtains, I saw my mother cover her mouth in horror, finally understanding the magnitude of what had just happened. Mr. Harrison stood silently to the side, watching the execution with professional awe. I turned to him, retrieving a crisp $100 bill from my purse and placing it in his hand. "Thank you for the offer of the VIP suite, Mr. Harrison," I said, projecting complete calm. But I've suddenly lost my appetite. Please ensure my family settles their bill before they leave. I have a feeling their credit cards might start declining very soon. I didn't wait for a response. I turned my back on them and walked out the heavy brass doors of the restaurant. The cool Chicago night air hit my face clean and refreshing. Behind me, I could hear Jason shouting my name, his voice echoing frantically in the lobby, but I kept walking. The valet brought my unassuming sedan around. I tipped him, got in, and drove away from the curb. I left my brother, my sister-in-law, and my parents trapped in a nightmare of their own making. I had never felt so utterly, beautifully free. The war was far from over, but the first battle belonged entirely to me. As I navigated my unassuming sedan away from the curb and merged into the flow of downtown Chicago traffic, the silence inside my car lasted exactly 4 minutes. Then my phone illuminated the dark cabin. It vibrated violently against the center console, a harsh, continuous mechanical buzzing that signaled the absolute destruction of their carefully constructed reality. I glanced at the glowing screen. It was Jason. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. 2 seconds later, the screen flashed again. It was my father, Thomas. Then my mother, Diane. Then Jason again, this time rapid-firing text messages so quickly my screen blurred into a solid, unreadable wall of notifications. The shift in their collective tone was instantaneous, profound, and entirely predictable. The exact same people who had just publicly banished me to a plastic children's table next to the swinging kitchen doors were now acting as though their very survival depended on hearing my voice. I tapped the sleek infotainment screen on my dashboard, connecting my phone to the car's premium audio system, and pressed play on the first voicemail that came through. It was Naomi. Her voice echoed loudly through the speakers, completely stripped of its previous malicious arrogance. She sounded breathless, frantic, and her tone was dripping with a sugary, fabricated sweetness that made my stomach physically turn. "Gemma, oh my goodness, please pick up." Naomi began, her voice trembling slightly in a desperate attempt to sound genuine. "Listen, we are so incredibly sorry about what just happened back there. That idiot manager, Mr. Harrison, completely ruined the entire evening. The restaurant staff totally messed up the seating chart. It was just a massive, horrible mix-up. We never intended for you to sit near the kitchen with the kids. You know how disorganized these pretentious places can get when they're busy." Jason is beside himself right now. He's practically in tears in the lobby. "Please, Gemma, just turn the car around and come back. We'll get a private room right now. We'll order the absolute best food on the menu, whatever you want. We just want to celebrate with you. You're our family. Please just call us back right now." I hit delete. The sheer audacity of her lie was staggering, almost comical. A massive mix-up. Just 15 short minutes prior, she had looked me dead in the eye, blocked my path, and explicitly told me my mere presence would bring down their elite aesthetic. Now suddenly, it was all the restaurant's fault. It was the classic toxic pivot when caught in their cruelty. They immediately played the victim of circumstance, refusing to take an ounce of accountability for their actions. The next voicemail began playing automatically. This time it was Jason. His voice was completely devoid of the swaggering tech mogul persona he had been broadcasting all night. "Gemma, it's me," Jason said, his breathing heavy and uneven. "Look, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. I was stressed. Richard Vance was sitting right there, and I was just trying to project a certain image. You have to understand the pressure I'm under. You can't do this to me. You can't cancel that pitch meeting tomorrow. My entire life is on the line here. If Vanguard pulls out, I'm finished. The suppliers are going to file for bankruptcy against me by Friday. Naomi is losing her mind. Just answer the phone, please. We can talk about this like adults. Just answer the damn phone, Gemma." His plea ended with a sharp, desperate click. Then a text message preview from my mother flashed across the screen. "Gemma, you cannot do this to your brother. He made a mistake, but he is your family. You have money now. You have a duty to help us. Do not be selfish and vindictive. God is watching how you treat your own blood. Do not be selfish." The irony was so thick I could practically choke on it. They had spent my entire 33 years of life taking everything from me, minimizing my achievements, draining my resources, and demanding my silent compliance to fuel Jason's massive, fragile ego. And the exact second they realized I possessed financial leverage over them, my firm refusal to be abused was instantly labeled as selfishness. I reached over and flipped my phone face down on the leather console. I didn't block their numbers yet. I wanted to see exactly how desperate they would become. I wanted a meticulously documented record of their complete unraveling. But I was absolutely done responding. The boundary was set, and it was forged in iron. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a respectful seat at their table, and tonight I had finally realized I owned the entire building. I drove away from the bustling neon-lit restaurant district and headed straight toward the Gold Coast, one of the most affluent residential neighborhoods in the entire country. My family sincerely believed I lived in a cramped, miserable studio apartment on the gritty outskirts of the city. It was a delusion they happily maintained because they had never actually bothered to visit me once in the past 5 years. They thought my modest sedan was a glaring sign of poverty, completely oblivious to the fact that I chose to drive it purely because I despised drawing attention to my wealth in public spaces. I pulled up to the heavy steel security gates of my luxury tower. The guard waved me into the subterranean garage. I bypassed rows of expensive sports cars parking in my private spot. The secured elevator carried me up 40 floors in perfect silence, opening directly into my 4,000 square foot penthouse. The contrast was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, washing over my imported furniture and curated art. There was no screaming, no fake posturing, and absolutely no unnecessary family drama. I smiled. I poured myself a glass of cold mineral water from the kitchen island, enjoying the absolute pristine tranquility of my massive penthouse. But my phone resting on the sleek marble counter refused to stay dark. A rapid, frantic succession of text messages from my mother illuminated the screen. I finally picked the device up, watching Diane seamlessly pivot from desperate begging to outright aggression. The helpless victim act was clearly failing, so she naturally reverted to her favorite, most reliable weapon, overwhelming guilt. "Gemma, you are being incredibly petty," her first message read. "Canceling your own brother's pitch meeting out of pure spite is evil. You are holding a grudge and it is actively destroying this family." A second message immediately followed. "You need to let the past go. We did our absolute best for both of you. You always have to play the tragic victim. Jason desperately needs this money, and you clearly have more than enough to share. Stop being vindictive. Holding a grudge." I read those 3 words twice, letting a dry, humorless laugh escape my lips. My mother loved to selectively rewrite history to suit her immediate narrative. She called it holding a grudge. I called it a permanent, expensive lesson in survival. My mind violently snapped back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Exactly 12 years ago, I was 21 years old, standing in the cramped, poorly lit financial aid office of my state university, holding a massive tuition bill I suddenly couldn't pay. The financial advisor, a tired older man with thick glasses, looked at me with profound pity as he explained the devastating reality. The $50,000 college fund my late grandparents had carefully set up for my future was completely gone. The account had been systematically drained over the course of 3 short months. Panicked, terrified, and utterly confused, I had sprinted back to my tiny dorm room and called my parents, genuinely thinking our identities had been stolen by criminals. Diane answered the phone that day, her voice completely devoid of any guilt or remorse. She casually, almost cheerfully explained that Jason had a supposedly brilliant idea for a customized luxury sneaker app. He aggressively needed seed capital, and since my degree in finance was, in her exact words, "just a cute backup plan until you find a wealthy husband to support you." They simply transferred my entire tuition fund to his private business account. They didn't ask for my permission. They didn't even warn me. They just reached in and took it. That revolutionary sneaker app crashed and burned entirely just 6 months later. Jason never sold a single product. Instead, he used the remaining scraps of my stolen college money to buy a vintage European sports car, claiming he desperately needed retail therapy to cope with his tragic entrepreneurial depression. Standing in my dorm room that day, I was left with only two options. I could drop out of school, admit absolute defeat, and return to their toxic house to live under their thumb forever. Or I could choose to survive. I chose survival. I immediately took out massive, suffocating student loans at crushing interest rates just to keep my seat in the classroom. I secured a grueling job working overnight shifts at a bleak, freezing logistics warehouse on the edge of town. I slept exactly 3 hours a night on a lumpy mattress before dragging my exhausted body to morning lectures. I lived off discounted rice, cheap beans, and sheer unadulterated spite. During that exact same time period, my parents were throwing lavish, heavily catered parties at their sprawling colonial home to loudly celebrate Jason getting a meaningless, unpaid interview at a minor tech blog. Upon my graduation, the living nightmare only intensified. I started my professional career at a ruthless, cutthroat investment bank in the city. I willingly subjected myself to brutal, soul-crushing 80-hour work weeks. I missed holidays. I missed birthdays. I missed vacations and social events. I systematically sacrificed my entire 20s to aggressively build my own capital from absolutely nothing. Every single bonus I earned, every promotion I secured, went straight into launching Vanguard equity. Meanwhile, my parents were perfectly happy to blindly finance Jason's ever-expanding fraudulent lifestyle. They secretly took out reckless secondary mortgages on their own retirement home just to fund his second, third, and fourth miserably failed startup attempts. They constantly publicly praised his bold entrepreneurial spirit while openly mocking my corporate grind at every single tense family dinner we shared. They treated his massive, catastrophic financial failures as brave strokes of genius while treating my actual quantifiable success as boring administrative labor. They actively celebrated his fake hollow success while aggressively sabotaging my real agonizing struggle. And now, after standing on my own 2 feet and conquering the financial world they so desperately worshipped, Diane had the sheer unmitigated nerve to text me about holding silly grudges. She honestly believed that a few $100,000 in stolen money and a decade of severe emotional abuse should just be swept under the rug because Jason was slightly stressed out. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, feeling an icy, untouchable calm wash over my entire body. I tapped the screen and slowly typed a single definitive reply to my mother. "You stole my solid foundation to build his fragile glass house," I wrote. "Don't act surprised when I absolutely refuse to pay for the shattered windows." I hit send without a second of hesitation. I placed my phone on silent, tossing it casually onto the couch. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the glittering, chaotic grid of the city below me. I had built an empire out of the exact ashes they left me in. Tomorrow morning, Jason would finally face the absolute crushing reality of his actions. Tomorrow morning, Vanguard Equity was going to war. The sun rose over Lake Michigan, casting a brilliant golden light across the Chicago skyline. I woke up feeling remarkably rested, completely untouched by the desperate chaos I knew was currently consuming my family. I went through my morning routine with absolute precision. I selected a sharp-tailored charcoal suit, pulled my hair back into a sleek professional style, and grabbed my briefcase. My private driver was waiting downstairs. I didn't take the sedan today. Today I took the black town car. I arrived at the towering glass and steel skyscraper that housed Vanguard Equity right at 7:30 in the morning. Our offices occupied the top 5 floors of the massive building, a fortress of high finance and corporate strategy. Walking into the sprawling, minimalist ground floor lobby always gave me a quiet sense of triumph. I nodded to the security guards, who immediately straightened up and greeted me with deep respect. The marble floors gleamed under the recessed lighting. It was a beautiful sanctuary of total order and control. But as I approached the private executive elevators, a loud, chaotic disturbance shattered the pristine quiet of the morning. High-pitched, frantic voices echoed from the main entrance. I stopped, turning around just in time to see Jason, Naomi, and my mother Diane shoving their way past the main concierge desk. The head of building security was already moving to intercept them, his hand resting on his radio. Jason looked absolutely atrocious. His custom suit from the night before was heavily wrinkled. His tie was missing, and dark, exhausted bags hung heavily under his bloodshot eyes. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a single second. A man who had spent the entire night watching his fake empire crumble into dust. Naomi was aggressively clutching a massive, oversized designer handbag, her face tight and furious. Diane was trailing right behind them, aggressively pointing her finger at the security guards and loudly demanding they step aside. "Ms. Caldwell," the head of security said, stepping firmly between my family and me. "Do you know these individuals? They completely bypassed the guest registry and are refusing to present proper identification." Before I could even answer, Jason lunged forward, his voice cracking with a desperate, unhinged energy. "Gemma, tell these rent-a-cops to back off right now. We're your family. We need to talk to you immediately." I looked at the security guard and offered a small, calm nod. "It's fine, Marcus. They're with me. You can step down." Marcus instantly stepped back, though he kept a very close, watchful eye on Jason and his erratic movements. I crossed my arms, maintaining a strict physical distance. "You have exactly 2 minutes to explain why you are screaming in the lobby of my corporate headquarters," I stated coldly. Jason didn't waste a single second. He aggressively stepped into my personal space, holding out his hand with an entitled, demanding expectation. "Give me the check, Gemma. I know you still have it. You showed it to me last night. $100,000. I need you to sign it over to my holding company right now. My primary supplier just sent a final default notice at 6 this morning. If I don't wire them massive capital by noon, they're locking me out of my own servers. Give me the envelope and we can forget everything that happened at the restaurant." He actually believed he was in a position to negotiate. He honestly thought he could demand my money while simultaneously granting me a supposed pardon for the events of the previous evening. The sheer blinding arrogance of his delusion was staggering. "I don't owe you a single cent, Jason," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "And I certainly do not negotiate with desperate men screaming in public lobbies. You missed your chance at funding when you shoved me to the kids' table." That was when Diane decided to deploy her ultimate emotional weapon. She stepped in front of Jason, physically pushing him back, and completely changed her entire demeanor. The aggressive, demanding mother vanished. In her place stood a fragile, deeply wounded woman, her eyes welling up with perfectly manufactured tears. "Gemma, please," Diane pleaded, reaching out and gently touching my arm. I sharply pulled back. Diane sniffled, pretending to be deeply hurt by my rejection. "You have to stop this cruel game. I know you're still angry about the past, but family must stick together. We are blood. Blood is thicker than money, Gemma. You're punishing your brother for tiny mistakes he made when he was young and foolish. You've built this massive, beautiful company. You're so successful. Why are you purposely trying to destroy him when you have so much to give?" I stared at her, utterly repulsed by her toxic gaslighting. "Stealing my college fund was not a tiny mistake, Diane. It was a targeted theft." But Diane wasn't finished. She leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a dramatic, breathy whisper so the security guards couldn't hear. "And you're not just punishing Jason anymore, Gemma. You're punishing an innocent child." I frowned, genuinely confused for a split second. "What are you talking about?" Naomi stepped forward, placing a protective hand over her perfectly flat stomach. She looked down at the marble floor, playing the role of a terrified, vulnerable mother-to-be. "I'm pregnant, Gemma. We just found out last week. I'm 2 months along. The stress of this bankruptcy is severely affecting my health. My doctor said my blood pressure is dangerously high. If Jason loses the company, we lose our health insurance. We lose our home. Do you really want your niece or nephew to be born into poverty? Are you really that heartless?" I looked at Naomi and her fake performance. I stared directly at her stomach, then slowly moved my gaze up to meet her eyes. I searched her face for even a fraction of a second of genuine maternal fear, but all I saw was a desperate, calculating panic. I knew instantly it was a massive, disgusting lie. Naomi drank 3 large glasses of vintage champagne last night at the restaurant. Pregnant women do not casually guzzle $500 bottles of alcohol just to impress venture capitalists. They were actively using a fake non-existent unborn child to emotionally extort me into writing a check. The absolute depravity of their manipulation instantly destroyed whatever tiny shred of sympathy I had left hidden inside my heart. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse her of lying right there in the open lobby. Instead, I simply smiled a very thin, perfectly polite corporate smile. I turned my body toward the private elevators and gestured for them to follow me inside the secure access doors. If you want to talk about family and finances, I said smoothly, then follow me upstairs. Let's take a very close look at the real numbers. The glass doors of the private elevator slid silently shut, sealing the four of us inside the wood-paneled cab. As the elevator ascended rapidly to the executive penthouse level of Vanguard Equity, the tension in the enclosed space was suffocating. Jason stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the digital floor indicator, desperately trying to maintain his crumbling facade of control. Naomi stood close to him, playing the part of the fragile, expectant mother. Diane stood right behind me, radiating a smug, triumphant energy, honestly believing her pathetic, fake crying had worked. The heavy brass doors opened into the breathtaking primary reception area of my firm. The entire massive floor was completely encased in thick floor-to-ceiling glass. Dozens of highly paid financial analysts and senior executives moved purposefully, offering me respectful nods as I walked past. Jason swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the massive operation I commanded. I led them directly into my private glass-enclosed conference room at the corner of the building. It was an intimidating space. "Take a seat," I instructed calmly. Jason immediately dropped into a leather chair. "Okay, Gemma, we're here," he said, his voice tight and rushed. "You're a big-shot CEO. Now please just pull out your checkbook. The bank wire cutoff is at noon, and I need that $100,000 transferred immediately." Naomi placed her oversized designer handbag on the table. "Thank you, Gemma," she offered with a tight fake smile. Diane sat down, crossing her arms defensively. "You're doing the right thing," she added with absolute dripping condescension. I stood at the very head of the cold marble table. I didn't reach for a checkbook. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out three thick, heavy black folders. I tossed them onto the marble in front of Jason, Naomi, and Diane. The folders landed with a heavy, dull thud. "What's this?" Jason demanded. "Where is the check?" "That is the exact reason you are never getting a penny from Vanguard Equity," I stated coldly. "Open it." Jason hesitated for a long, agonizing moment before flipping the heavy cover open. Naomi leaned over his shoulder, scanning the first page. Diane slowly opened hers, completely confused by the financial spreadsheets. "When you constantly begged my firm for a massive bailout investment over the past 6 months, you triggered an automatic internal protocol," I explained smoothly, pacing slowly behind my chair. "Vanguard Equity doesn't just hand out capital to anyone who asks nicely. We deploy a highly aggressive specialized team of forensic accountants to conduct a deep, rigorous audit of any company requesting our funds. We look at every single bank statement. We look at every single wire transfer. We verify every single asset down to the last penny." Jason's face instantly drained of all color. "You audited my internal servers." He choked out sheer panic, replacing his arrogant facade. "I audited everything, Jason," I replied. "And what my forensic analyst discovered was fascinating. You spent the last 3 years parading around Chicago acting like a brilliant tech visionary. But according to page 4 of that dossier, your company doesn't actually own a single piece of intellectual property. You outsourced the entire coding process to a cheap third-rate firm overseas, and they hold all the licensing rights. Your startup is a completely hollow shell. You have zero viable products, zero actual revenue, and massive crushing liabilities." Diane looked up, her brow furrowed in deep, angry confusion. "Gemma, what on earth are you talking about? Jason's company is valued at $10 million. He lied to you, Diane. He lied to everyone. Turn to page 12. Jason frantically flipped the pages, his breath hitching loudly. Naomi grabbed his arm, her manicured fingernails digging into his jacket. "Page 12 details your corporate expense accounts," I continued. For the past 18 months, your company has been bleeding investor capital directly into your personal pockets. I leaned forward, trapping Jason in my relentless gaze. You and Naomi have been systematically embezzling corporate funds to finance your fake billionaire lifestyle. You used company money to lease those two luxury imported sports cars you love to brag about. You used company money to fund your extravagant European vacations. I shifted my eyes directly to Naomi. She was shaking violently, her fake pregnancy forgotten. And Naomi, my analysts flagged over $40,000 in corporate funds that were illegally wired to high-end retail boutiques over the last 6 months. Those designer handbags you flaunt, including the massive one sitting on my conference table right now, were entirely paid for by defrauded investors. Naomi frantically snatched her bag off the marble table and instantly dropped it to the floor as if it had suddenly caught fire. She was completely paralyzed by the overwhelming, indisputable proof of her crimes. But the absolute best part, I added softly, is on page 22. Jason slowly and painfully turned his shaking hands to the page. A single tear slipped down his pale cheek. I looked at my mother, who was staring at the paper in horrified shock. That $500 bottle of vintage champagne Jason ordered last night to impress Richard Vance. The dinner where you specifically banished me to the kids' table because I was too poor to fit your aesthetic. Jason paid for that entire meal using the absolute last remaining funds in his corporate account. He intentionally used stolen money to publicly humiliate me. Jason buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, desperate sob. He was entirely and completely broken. The arrogant golden child of our family was finally exposed for exactly what he was. "You're not just a failed businessman, Jason," I said, delivering the final crushing blow as I looked down at his shaking shoulders. "You're a massive fraud and you're a criminal, and you have absolutely no idea the level of devastation that is coming next." Jason didn't say another word. He practically scrambled out of the leather chair, his face buried in his hands, and rushed toward the glass doors of the conference room. Diane followed closely behind him, her face completely pale, entirely silent for the first time in my entire life. Naomi was the last to leave. She didn't look broken, she looked cornered. As she bent down to pick up her illegally purchased designer bag, she shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom. The terrified, vulnerable act was entirely gone. In its place was the ruthless, highly trained public relations director who had built a career on twisting narratives and destroying reputations. She walked out of my office, the heavy glass doors sliding shut behind her, sealing my victory. But a cornered animal is always the most dangerous. And Naomi had a very specific set of skills. She knew that legally and financially they were completely destroyed. So she decided to wage war in the only arena she still had access to, the court of public opinion. Exactly 48 hours after that meeting, my phone started buzzing relentlessly on my desk. It wasn't my family this time. It was my lead communications director. I answered the call, and she immediately told me to open my primary social media accounts. Naomi had just dropped a nuclear bomb on the internet. I opened my laptop and clicked the link my director sent. It was a video Naomi had posted across every major platform. It already had 2 million views and was climbing rapidly. The production value was manipulative perfection. Naomi, who typically wore heavy glamorous makeup and custom-tailored outfits, was sitting on a beige couch in a dimly lit, modest-looking room. She wore no makeup. She wore a baggy, inexpensive gray sweater. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. As the video started, she let out a shaky, perfectly timed sigh and gently placed a hand over her completely flat stomach, heavily implying her fake pregnancy. "Hi, everyone." Naomi began, her voice quivering with expertly manufactured trauma. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this, but my family is being completely destroyed by someone with unimaginable wealth and zero humanity, and I have nowhere else to turn." I sat back in my chair, resting my chin on my hand, watching her perform. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Naomi stared directly into the camera lens, letting a single dramatic tear roll down her cheek. She completely omitted the massive embezzlement, the failing startup, and the stolen college funds. Instead, she spun a terrifying fairy tale. She claimed that Jason had built a thriving, beautiful small business intended to support their growing family and care for my aging parents. Then she introduced the villain. She named me directly. She explicitly labeled me a cutthroat, greedy corporate raider who used Vanguard equity to aggressively manipulate the debt markets just to crush her own brother out of pure jealousy. She makes millions of dollars a day, Naomi cried to the camera, clutching a tissue. And yet she wants to leave her own elderly parents homeless. Thomas and Diane are terrified. They gave her everything, and she threw them away like garbage just to secure a slightly higher profit margin. But Naomi didn't stop at financial defamation. She knew she needed a social justice angle to guarantee the video went viral. She leaned forward, her face twisting into an expression of deep systemic pain. She played the ultimate trump card. As an African American woman trying to build a life in the corporate world, I have faced so many hurdles, Naomi whispered softly, looking heartbroken. But the absolute worst discrimination I have ever experienced came from my own sister-in-law. Gemma has always looked down on me. She has always made it explicitly clear that I don't belong at their family table. She despises that Jason married a strong black woman, and now she is using her massive corporate power to silence me and to put my unborn child at risk. The video ended with Naomi burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably while begging the internet for prayers and support. The fallout was instantaneous and explosive. Naomi had successfully weaponized the internet. She had perfectly combined every single trigger point the public loved to rage about: corporate greed, elder abuse, and racial discrimination. The comment section was a bloodbath of blind outrage. People were tagging Vanguard Equity, demanding I be investigated. Strangers were calling for my immediate resignation. Influencers were making reaction videos analyzing Naomi's body language and declaring her a brave survivor of corporate abuse. My parents had completely backed her up, appearing in a short follow-up clip, looking old, frail, and devastated. My communications director was talking rapidly through the phone, outlining emergency press releases and crisis management strategies. She wanted to issue an immediate public denial. She wanted to threaten legal action for defamation. She was in full panic mode, terrified that this viral smear campaign would severely impact our current acquisitions and scare off our institutional investors. I didn't panic. I watched the video a second time, analyzing every single word Naomi said. I looked at the specific phrasing she used to accuse me of financial crimes. I looked at the explicit claims she made about Vanguard Equity's operations. Cancel the emergency press release. I told my communications director, my voice perfectly calm and steady. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. But Gemma, she said, her voice frantic, this is trending #1 nationwide. They're calling you a racist corporate vulture. If we don't control this narrative right now, the board is going to step in. I closed my laptop with a soft, decisive click. Let them talk, I said. Naomi thinks she's playing a game of public relations, but she just publicly accused a heavily regulated financial institution of targeted market manipulation and predatory lending. She didn't just defame me personally, she defamed the corporation. I smiled, feeling a cold, dark sense of satisfaction wash over me. Naomi had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them permanently. She thought a viral video would force me to surrender. She had no idea she had just walked directly into a massive, inescapable legal trap. Let the internet scream for another day, I ordered. Don't release a single statement. Let Naomi feel like she has won. I hung up the phone. The smear campaign was vicious, and the public hatred was intense, but it was entirely based on verifiable lies. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. My family wanted a public spectacle. They wanted to drag my name through the mud and force me to write a check to make the pain stop. They severely underestimated my tolerance for pain. I wasn't going to fight them on social media. I picked up my phone again, dialed my lead corporate attorney, and told him to begin drafting the most aggressive corporate defamation lawsuit in the history of Chicago. Within 24 hours of Naomi posting her highly fabricated video, the digital wildfire breached the heavy walls of my personal life. I had instructed my legal team to prepare the corporate defamation lawsuit in complete silence. But the internet doesn't wait for the justice system. The court of public opinion moves at the absolute speed of a fiber optic connection, and it was aggressively out for blood. My private email inbox, a heavily guarded address known only to close colleagues and trusted associates, became an absolute cesspool of hatred. The flying monkeys arrived exactly on schedule. Extended family members who hadn't bothered to speak to me in over a decade suddenly felt deeply entitled to aggressively critique my morality. Aunt Sarah, who had conveniently ignored my existence since I was a teenager, sent a massive block of text calling me a disgusting disgrace to the Caldwell family name. She violently accused me of being poisoned by wealth and corporate greed. My cousin Mark, who was currently unemployed and living in his mother's basement, sent me a frantic voice note screaming that I was a classist snob who deserved to be completely isolated and ruined. But the estranged family members were just the first pathetic wave. The social media algorithm had violently pushed Naomi's tearful performance to millions of completely uninformed strangers, and they eagerly joined the digital mob. My corporate voicemail was rapidly flooded with violent, unhinged threats from anonymous callers. They loudly demanded I empty my bank accounts and give everything I own to my poor, oppressed sister-in-law. They called me a corporate vulture. They called me a heartless monster. The sheer overwhelming volume of vitriol was staggering. It was a massive, highly coordinated attempt to psychologically break me into complete submission. Naomi and Jason knew the internet outrage would eventually fade if they didn't keep feeding it. So they deliberately kept pouring gasoline on the fire. 2 days later, my parents escalated the smear campaign to a much more damaging level. Thomas and Diane appeared as guest victims on a highly popular local Chicago podcast known exclusively for sensationalizing family trauma and manufacturing outrage. The host, a loud, opportunistic man who thrived on digital conflict, gave them an entire hour of completely unedited airtime to destroy my reputation. I sat in my secure glass office and listened to the audio broadcast with absolute cold detachment. My mother sounded incredibly weak and fragile. She practically sobbed into the studio microphone, spinning a horrifying false narrative about how they had sacrificed absolutely everything to give me a perfect childhood, only for me to abandon them the exact second I made my first million. She completely neglected to mention the stolen college funds or the decades of severe emotional abuse. Then my father took the microphone. Thomas played the role of the exhausted, heartbroken patriarch perfectly. He sighed heavily, claiming his only wish before he died was to see his divided family united. He told the host that his cruel daughter firmly refused to save her own brother from utter financial ruin over a tiny, meaningless seating misunderstanding at a birthday dinner. He painted Jason as a brilliant, struggling entrepreneur who was simply being bullied and crushed by my massive corporate machine. It was a spectacular, horrifying performance. The podcast episode went viral instantly, generating hundreds of thousands of angry comments and aggressive shares. The social pressure was heavily designed to be absolutely suffocating. And for the very first time since this war began, it actually started to threaten the foundation of Vanguard equity. The real crisis hit at exactly 200 in the afternoon on a Thursday. My executive assistant buzzed my intercom, her voice tight with genuine professional panic. "Mr. Sterling is on line 1, she announced quickly. "He insists on speaking with you immediately." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. Arthur Sterling was the head of a massive state pension fund. He was our largest institutional investor, strictly controlling hundreds of millions of dollars in assets that Vanguard Equity managed. He was also a deeply conservative, old-school businessman who absolutely despised negative public relations. I picked up the heavy phone receiver. "Good afternoon, Arthur," I said smoothly. "Gemma, what on earth is going on over there?" Arthur demanded. His voice was sharp and entirely unforgiving. "I have seen your board members forwarding me viral videos of your sister-in-law sobbing about being evicted. I have important politicians sending me podcast clips of your parents accusing you of severe elder abuse. We gave you our capital because Vanguard Equity represents stability and total discretion. This absolute media circus is the exact opposite of discretion. Arthur, the claims being made in those online videos are entirely fabricated, I replied, maintaining a calm, highly authoritative tone. It's a desperate extortion attempt by a failing business owner who unfortunately happens to be my brother. My corporate legal team is already handling the situation aggressively. Arthur let out a harsh, heavily frustrated breath. I don't care about the truth, Gemma. I care entirely about the optics. My board doesn't want their massive pension funds managed by someone trending on social media for destroying her own family. This kind of toxic exposure makes our retirees extremely nervous. You have massive financial resources. Just pay them off right now. Settle the dispute quietly. Give your brother the money he wants. Make them sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and make this completely disappear by Monday morning. If this scandal is still in the news cycle next week, we are permanently pulling our capital. He hung up the phone before I could even respond. The dial tone echoed loudly in my silent glass office. The stakes had suddenly skyrocketed to a catastrophic level. Naomi and Jason had actually managed to hit a critical nerve. If Arthur Sterling pulled his massive pension fund, other institutional investors would instantly panic and follow suit. Vanguard Equity could lose hundreds of millions in managed assets in a matter of days. The massive empire I had built through blood, sweat, and relentless, grueling sacrifice was suddenly teetering on the edge of a cliff, all because my family had successfully weaponized the internet against me. They honestly thought they had finally cornered me. They firmly believed the massive threat of losing my entire business would force me to surrender, sign the bailout check, and beg for their forgiveness. They expected me to cave to the suffocating social pressure and protect my wealth by submitting to their emotional extortion. I placed the phone down on my desk. I looked at the massive stacks of financial dossiers sitting next to my computer monitor. Jason was demanding $100,000 to make the bad press magically go away. He wanted me to buy my own peace. I didn't feel a single ounce of fear. I felt a deep, terrifying clarity. I was not going to negotiate with digital terrorists, and I was absolutely not going to pay my lifelong abusers for the privilege of being left alone. If Arthur Sterling wanted to pull his capital because he was afraid of a fake viral video that was his own massive weakness, I firmly refused to let my toxic family hold my company hostage for ransom. I picked up my secure private phone. I bypassed my corporate attorneys and dialed a very specific direct number. It was time to completely stop playing defense. It was time to show Jason, Naomi, and my parents exactly what happens when you try to aggressively burn down the house of the person who actually owns the deed. I was going to rip the entire foundation out from under them in absolute devastating silence. The phone rang exactly twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered on the other end of the line. I gave my private investigator Silas a very simple, highly lucrative directive. I needed every single hidden offshore account, deleted text message, and encrypted file. Jason and Naomi thought they had successfully buried. Silas didn't ask questions. He simply named his exorbitant price and promised absolute results within the hour. I hung up the phone feeling a cold, razor-sharp focus replace the temporary irritation caused by Arthur Sterling and his panicked pension fund board. I walked back to my desk, my heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor, ready to finalize the corporate defamation lawsuit with my legal team. But before I could even touch my intercom, a single sharp notification chimed from my secondary monitor. It wasn't a corporate alert. It was a message arriving in my highly restricted, heavily encrypted personal email inbox. The sender address was a scrambled proxy, but the subject line was blatantly obvious. It simply read, "A final offer for peace." I clicked open the message, my eyes scanning the text. It was from Jason. Clearly, the viral success of Naomi and her fabricated tears had completely inflated his massive delusional ego. He firmly believed the immense social pressure and the very real threat to Vanguard Equity had finally broken my resolve. He thought he possessed the ultimate leverage, and he was ready to cash in his chips. The email wasn't a plea for a familial truce. It was a cold, calculated, legally disastrous extortion demand. Jason completely abandoned the previous request for $100,000 to save his failing startup. The viral internet fame had made them incredibly greedy. He stated in very clear, unambiguous language that the price for my public redemption had skyrocketed. He demanded a direct, untraceable wire transfer of exactly $500,000 to a newly established offshore holding account. The email explicitly broke down the ridiculous justification for the massive price increase. Jason arrogantly typed that the original $100,000 was still required to satisfy his immediate corporate debts. The remaining $400,000, however, was classified as mandatory compensation for severe emotional distress. He claimed the money was necessary to ensure Naomi had a completely stress-free environment for her entirely fabricated pregnancy. I even had the absolute audacity to include a small line item for my parents stating that a portion of the funds would go toward buying Thomas and Diane a luxury retirement condo in Florida, effectively rewarding them for their vicious podcast performance. It was a complete unapologetic shakedown. They were demanding I finance their fraudulent lifestyle, their fake medical emergencies, and their luxurious retirement, all under the immediate threat of total corporate sabotage. If the $500,000 cleared the account, Naomi would immediately remove the viral video from all platforms. She would then publish a carefully scripted public apology, claiming her pregnancy hormones and severe emotional distress had caused her to violently misunderstand a minor financial disagreement. Furthermore, my parents would return to the aggressive local podcast and completely retract their statements, telling the world that their loving daughter had generously stepped in to save the family. They would clear my name entirely, restoring the pristine reputation of Vanguard Equity and securing my institutional investors. But the final paragraph of the email was the most revealing. Jason gave me exactly 24 hours to comply. If the money was not in the account by noon the following day, Naomi would release a second, much more damaging video. This time, she would include heavily doctored financial documents provided by Jason, falsely showing that Vanguard Equity was actively engaged in massive predatory lending against minority-owned small businesses across the United States. He threatened to trigger a full federal investigation that would tie my firm up in brutal litigation for years, permanently destroying my entire corporate empire. I sat in my silent glass office staring at the glowing monitor, absolutely mesmerized by the sheer unadulterated stupidity of my brother. Jason wasn't a criminal mastermind. I was a desperate failing amateur who had spent his entire life being fiercely protected and coddled by our mother. He had never faced a single real consequence for his actions. He honestly believed he was executing a flawless, high-stakes power play. He thought he was backing a desperate, terrified woman into an inescapable corner. He completely failed to realize that he had just committed a massive federal crime, and he had stupidly documented the entire felony in writing. Extortion, blackmail, interstate wire fraud. He had seamlessly wrapped multiple massive federal offenses into a single beautifully formatted email. By threatening a heavily regulated financial institution with fabricated documents designed to trigger a federal investigation, he had crossed a terrifying legal line. The authorities do not look kindly on individuals attempting to manipulate the financial markets through targeted fraudulent blackmail. I read the message a second time, a genuine slow smile spreading across my face. It was the first time I had genuinely smiled since that disastrous birthday dinner at the Michelin star restaurant. My toxic family had spent my entire life manipulating the narrative, whispering lies in the shadows, and gaslighting me into believing I was always the problem. But now, driven by sheer greed and a completely false sense of internet invincibility, Jason had finally put the instrument of his own absolute destruction into writing. I did not reply to the email. I did not acknowledge his ridiculous ultimatum. Engaging with an extortionist only validates their perceived power, and Jason had absolutely zero power over me. I reached over and pressed a button on my desk console, instantly bringing my lead corporate attorney David onto a highly secure line. David, I said, my voice perfectly steady and cold, I am forwarding you an encrypted email from Jason right now. Don't respond to it. Just read it carefully. I heard the soft clicking of a keyboard through the speaker as David opened the file. There was a long, heavy silence that stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When David finally spoke, his highly professional, always calm voice carried a distinct trace of absolute shock. "Gemma," David said slowly, "this is a direct, undeniable demand for capital under the explicit threat of corporate sabotage and public defamation. He is threatening to fabricate financial documents to trigger a federal audit unless you wire $500,000 to an offshore proxy." "That's exactly how I read it," I replied smoothly. "This goes vastly beyond a simple civil defamation lawsuit, Gemma." David continued, his tone turning incredibly serious. "This is federal extortion. If I hand this single document over to our contacts at the Bureau, Jason will not just be bankrupt. He will be facing severe federal prison time. Are you entirely certain you want to cross this specific bridge? Because once I initiate this process, you cannot pull it back to protect your family." I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. I looked out over the sprawling Chicago skyline, the massive city where I had built my entire empire from the ground up. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the stolen college funds, the relentless gaslighting, and the vicious viral smear campaign currently trying to tear my life apart. They had demanded a dramatic escalating war, and they had specifically targeted my business to force my surrender. "I am not protecting them anymore, David," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute, unshakable finality. "Lock down the IP address, verify the offshore account routing numbers, package this email with the forensic audit of his failing company and the proof of his massive embezzlement. Prepare the final kill shot. I want all of it handed directly to federal authorities by the end of the day." "Understood," David replied, entirely abandoning his previous hesitation. "Consider it done." I ended the call. The countdown had officially started. 24 hours until Jason promised to unleash his final devastating public relations attack. 24 hours until my panicked institutional investors expected a quiet, compliant resolution. But they were all going to be massively, catastrophically disappointed. I was not going to pay my abusers a single dime, and I was certainly not going to wait for their artificial deadline. I was going to completely dismantle their lives before the sun even rose on their ultimatum. The 24-hour countdown initiated by Jason hung in the air of my office like a foul odor. I did not dignify his massive extortion attempt with a single keystroke of a response. Engaging with digital terrorists only provides them with the dangerous illusion that they have successfully captured your attention. Jason firmly believed he had backed me into a terrifying corner with his fabricated videos and aggressive federal threats. He expected me to panic. He expected me to desperately scramble my legal team to draft emergency settlement agreements. Most of all, he expected a massive wire transfer to hit his offshore proxy account by noon the following day. He was going to be waiting a very long time. I do not negotiate with criminals, and I certainly do not pay my lifelong abusers for the privilege of basic peace. Instead of playing his pathetic public relations game, I decided to wage a silent, highly targeted financial war. I summoned the head of my special acquisitions department to my glass corner office. Marcus was a brilliant, incredibly aggressive financial strategist who specialized in distressed assets and hostile corporate takeovers. I did not offer him a seat. I simply handed him the heavily encrypted digital dossier Silas had compiled on Jason and his failing startup. I knew exactly what I was doing. I was playing a game he could not even begin to comprehend. I gave Marcus one single, extremely clear directive. I wanted Vanguard equity to immediately identify target and acquire every single piece of outstanding debt associated with my brother. I did not care about the premium we had to pay to secure the contracts. I wanted total and complete ownership of his financial existence before the sunset. Marcus immediately deployed a highly specialized team of forensic debt buyers. They rapidly dissected the decaying corpse of Jason's corporate finances. What they discovered was a terrifying web of financial desperation. Because every traditional banking institution had already rejected his loan applications months ago, Jason had resorted to securing massive amounts of capital from shady private lenders and highly aggressive secondary credit markets. These were not forgiving corporate banks. These were ruthless private equity firms that charged astronomical interest rates and demanded absolute, uncompromising collateral. Jason had heavily leveraged everything he had just to keep his fake empire afloat for one more month. The first target on our acquisition list was the primary overseas software supplier. They were the entity that had originally threatened to lock Jason out of his own company's servers if he did not wire them massive capital. Marcus contacted their executive board directly. He offered them a completely irresistible cash buyout. We paid them 20% above the actual owed debt in exchange for the immediate, unquestioned transfer of the contract. The supplier eagerly accepted the massive premium. In less than 45 minutes, Vanguard Equity became the absolute owner of the exact technology infrastructure Jason needed to maintain his fake billionaire facade. We did not stop there. The acquisitions team moved with terrifying surgical precision. They tracked down the private luxury leasing firm that actually owned the two imported sports cars Jason and Naomi constantly flaunted on social media. Jason was severely behind on those massive monthly payments. Marcus bought the debt outright. He then systematically targeted the secondary lenders who had provided Jason with short-term bridge loans to cover his fraudulent payroll. My firm offered immediate liquid cash to every single one of those frustrated, angry creditors. They all gladly signed over their rights, incredibly relieved to instantly dump the toxic defaulting assets onto Vanguard Equity. By 5:00 in the afternoon, the massive, highly coordinated financial sweep was entirely complete. Marcus walked back into my office and placed a thick, heavy black binder on my marble desk. I slowly opened the cover, feeling a deep, dark sense of absolute triumph. The binder contained the consolidated, legally binding contracts of every single major liability Jason possessed. I had successfully weaponized my massive corporate liquidity. In less than 8 hours, Vanguard Equity had aggressively bought up every single loan, every single outstanding invoice, and every single piece of collateralized debt. I was no longer just the sister he had violently pushed away at a dinner table. I was now his primary unquestioned creditor. I literally owned the financial rights to his entire existence. I spent the next hour carefully reviewing the incredibly dense fine print of the private loan agreements Jason had so foolishly signed. The absolute arrogance of my brother was truly staggering. In his desperate manic rush to secure fast cash, he had completely ignored basic corporate legal protections. He had bypassed standard limited liability clauses. Instead, he and Naomi had foolishly signed strict personal guarantees on nearly every single massive private loan. They had legally tied their own personal assets to the toxic debt of the failing startup. It was a catastrophic, completely unforced error, because they had systematically embezzled corporate funds to pay for designer bags and European vacations. The corporate veil was already entirely pierced. Their personal bank accounts, their luxury possessions, and even the future equity they mistakenly thought they possessed were all completely vulnerable to aggressive seizure. The trap was now perfectly beautifully set. The jaws were locked wide open, completely hidden beneath the surface, just waiting for Jason to take one final arrogant step. He was currently sitting in his rented luxury apartment, aggressively watching the clock, deeply convinced that his extortion email was actively forcing me into total submission. He thought the public pressure was breaking my resolve. He honestly believed he was a master manipulator controlling the entire board. He had absolutely no idea that while he was busy weaponizing strangers on the internet, I had quietly purchased the very ground he was standing on. I closed the heavy black binder and locked it securely inside my desk drawer. The sun was beginning to set over the Chicago skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the marble floor of my office. The massive storm of public outrage was still violently raging online, but it no longer mattered. Let the digital mob scream. Let my parents cry on their sensationalized podcasts. I possessed the only thing that actually mattered in this world: total undisputed leverage. I gathered my briefcase, turned off the office lights, and headed toward the private elevators. Tomorrow morning, the 24-hour deadline for his pathetic extortion attempt would expire. But Jason was not going to get a massive wire transfer. He was going to get a very different kind of delivery. I was going to show them the real meaning of ruin. The deadline arrived at exactly noon the next day. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the final default notices my legal team had prepared when the absolute circus erupted downstairs. My intercom buzzed sharply. It was Marcus, the head of security, sounding genuinely alarmed. He quickly informed me that my family had returned to the building, but this time they were not alone. They had brought a massive camera crew directly into the pristine marble lobby of Vanguard Equity. I walked over to my security monitors and switched the live feed to the ground floor. Jason and Naomi were standing dead center in the massive space, looking incredibly smug. My parents flanked them heavily, leaning on each other to play their pathetic, fragile roles. And right in front of them stood a local freelance reporter, gripping a microphone and staring directly into a heavy broadcasting camera. I recognized him instantly. He was a notorious online tabloid journalist, known for aggressive ambush interviews, clearly one of Naomi's sleazy public relations contacts. Jason honestly believed I was cowering in my office. He deeply thought the absolute silence over the past 24 hours meant I was terrified. He brought the live stream to deliver the final crushing blow, aiming to publicly humiliate me into writing the extortion check right there on camera in front of a live audience. He wanted to corner me in my own fortress and force an immediate surrender. I watched the reporter loudly narrate the unfolding scene to his thousands of live viewers, pointing dramatically up toward the executive floors. Diane was already wiping away perfectly timed fake tears, acting like a devastated mother, begging for her cruel daughter to simply be reasonable. Naomi was gently clutching her flat stomach, playing the innocent pregnant victim for the massive online audience to see. They expected me to hide in fear. They expected me to send down an army of lawyers, or desperately order security to throw them out, which would only make me look incredibly guilty and defensive on the live feed. They desperately wanted a chaotic reaction to completely prove their fake narrative. I did not give them one. I grabbed my suit jacket, smoothed down my tailored skirt, and walked confidently out of my office. I bypassed the standard executive elevator and took the private glass lift that descended directly into the center of the main lobby. As the glass elevator slowly lowered me into the chaotic scene, the reporter spotted me immediately. He rushed forward and practically shoved the microphone into my face, the absolute second. The heavy doors parted aggressively, demanding to know why I was violently ruining my own flesh and blood. Jason tightly crossed his arms, wearing a sickeningly victorious smirk. He firmly thought he had absolutely won. He deeply thought the cameras were his ultimate shield. I was completely wrong. I stepped out of the elevator perfectly calm, holding a single heavy manila envelope, fully ready to end the entire war on live television. The harsh glare of the camera light hit my face the instant my heel touched the lobby floor. The reporter shoved his microphone dangerously close to my mouth, rapidly firing off aggressive questions about corporate greed and familial abandonment. Before I could even utter a single syllable in response, my mother decided it was time for her grand, heavily orchestrated performance. Diane let out a piercing, highly theatrical wail that echoed off the high marble ceilings of the lobby. She dramatically threw her hands in the air and collapsed directly onto her knees, right in front of the camera. The small crowd of employees and security guards that had gathered instantly gasped, completely shocked by the sudden chaotic display. "Gemma, please!" Diane shrieked, tears rapidly streaming down her carefully made-up face. She aggressively reached out, desperately grasping at the hem of my tailored suit skirt. "I am begging you on my knees in front of the whole world, just be a good sister. Stop this cruel, vindictive war. Jason is your own flesh and blood. How can you coldly stand there in your massive tower while your family starves in the streets? You have so much money. Just save him." It was a sickeningly brilliant piece of acting, perfectly calculated for maximum viral sympathy. Jason immediately sprang into action, playing his designated role as the fiercely protective, deeply wronged son. He rushed forward, dropping to one knee beside our mother and wrapping his arms tightly around her shaking shoulders. He looked up at me with a perfectly manufactured expression of utter disgust and moral superiority. "Look at what you're doing to her," Jason yelled, making absolutely sure his voice projected clearly over the lobby ambiance and straight into the microphone. You are completely destroying our mother over absolute petty jealousy. She's sick, Gemma. She can't handle this extreme stress. I only wanted to build a business to support this family, and you are using your massive billions to crush us into dust. Have you absolutely zero shame? While Jason and Diane commanded the floor, Naomi flawlessly worked the reporter. She stood slightly off to the side, maintaining a fragile, terrified posture. The camera quickly panned to catch her wiping a single delicate tear from her eye. She looked directly into the lens, her voice quivering with expertly calibrated trauma. We just want peace, Naomi whispered softly to the live audience, placing a protective hand over her completely flat, entirely fake pregnant stomach. We just want to safely raise our baby without being aggressively hunted by my sister-in-law and her massive corporate lawyers. She's trying to permanently silence us, but we will not be bullied by predatory wealth anymore. The reporter fiercely turned the microphone back to me, his eyes wide with predatory excitement. He was ready for me to shout, to desperately defend myself, or to angrily order security to forcefully remove my weeping mother from the premises. That would have given them the ultimate viral soundbite they desperately needed. Instead, I stood completely still. I looked down at Diane, clutching my skirt. I looked at Jason, feigning righteous anger. I looked at Naomi, playing the ultimate victim. I did not blink. I slowly raised the heavy manila envelope in my hand. Right behind me, the glass elevator door slid open a second time, and David, my lead corporate attorney, stepped out into the lobby. He was carrying two massive, heavily indexed legal binders. He walked calmly to my side, his presence instantly radiating an intense, undeniable authority that made the screaming reporter take a slight physical step back. I looked down at my mother, who was still desperately gripping my skirt, waiting for me to break down and apologize on camera. I simply pulled my fabric out of her hands, took one step back, and turned my entire attention away from my toxic family. I looked directly into the dark, blinking lens of the broadcasting camera. I did not offer a tearful defense. I did not waste a single second addressing the completely fabricated emotional attacks my family had just violently spewed across the internet. I was a chief executive officer, and I was going to dismantle their entire fraudulent operation with absolute undeniable corporate precision. Good afternoon, I said, my voice perfectly level, completely cutting through the heavy tension in the lobby. My name is Gemma Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Equity. For the past 48 hours, the individuals kneeling on this floor have launched a highly coordinated, vicious smear campaign against myself and my financial institution. They have leveraged fake tears, fabricated claims of elder abuse, and wildly false allegations of racial discrimination to manipulate public sympathy. They came here today, hoping to violently extort me into writing a massive check to save their failing business. The reporter aggressively shoved the microphone forward again, desperate to regain control of the narrative. But they are your family, he shouted loudly. Are you denying that you absolutely refused to help your own brother when he came to you in need? I am not denying anything, I replied coldly, never breaking eye contact with the camera lens. I am explicitly stating that Jason is a massive fraud, and I firmly refuse to finance his criminal behavior. I gestured for David to hand me the first legal binder. I opened it and held up a massive stack of highlighted banking records directly to the camera. Jason did not build a thriving small business to help his family. He built a completely hollow shell corporation. He outsourced all of his actual coding, owns absolutely zero intellectual property, and has generated zero actual revenue in 3 entire years. Jason scrambled to his feet, his face suddenly draining of all color. The smug, victorious smirk was instantly wiped away, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. Gemma, shut up, he yelled, lunging forward aggressively. Shut your mouth right now before I make you. Marcus, my head of security, immediately stepped between us, placing a massive, unyielding hand firmly on Jason's chest and forcefully shoving him back into place. While he was desperately begging honest investors for capital to supposedly pay his hardworking employees, I continued smoothly to the camera. He and his wife Naomi were systematically embezzling massive amounts of corporate funds. They illegally wired tens of thousands of dollars to high-end retail boutiques to purchase luxury designer handbags. They used defrauded investor money to lease two imported sports cars. They used company accounts to fund extravagant European vacations. Naomi gasped loudly, taking a massive step away from the reporter, as if the broadcasting camera had suddenly become dangerously radioactive. The reporter quickly turned to her, his eyes wide, sensing a massive career-defining twist in the story. "Naomi, is that true?" he demanded sharply. "Are you using corporate investor funds to buy personal luxury items?" Naomi aggressively covered her face with her illegally purchased expensive handbag, completely abandoning her fragile pregnant victim routine, and desperately tried to push her way out of the tight camera frame. "But that is only the civil fraud," I said, raising my voice just enough to command absolute attention in the echoing space. Jason, however, decided to escalate this to a severe federal level. Yesterday afternoon, he sent me a highly encrypted, perfectly documented extortion demand. He explicitly threatened to fabricate financial documents and falsely accuse Vanguard Equity of predatory lending. Unless I wired exactly $500,000 to a newly established offshore bank account by noon today. He specifically stated this stolen money was to buy my parents a luxury retirement condo and fund his fake billionaire lifestyle. The entire busy lobby went completely dead silent. The only sound was the soft, continuous mechanical whir of the broadcasting camera. Diane slowly stood up from the hard floor, her fake tears completely dried up, her mouth hanging open in sheer horror. She looked at Jason, finally realizing the catastrophic, inescapable legal trap her golden child had just blindly walked into. "You're lying!" Jason screamed, his voice cracking violently. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately looking for an exit that did not exist. "She's making all of it up for the cameras. She's just trying to legally destroy me." "I am not making anything up, Jason," I replied, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. I handed the printed extortion evidence to David, who held it up clearly for the camera lens. "We have already submitted the entire digital file, including the offshore routing numbers and the proxy IP address, directly to the federal authorities. You will likely be receiving a very official visit from them before the end of the day. But I am not just leaving your total destruction to the justice system," I added, pulling the heavy manila envelope from under my arm. "You thought you could publicly humiliate me into paying off your massive, crushing debt. You thought the immense social pressure would force Vanguard Equity to surrender. But you completely fail to understand how real power actually operates. I do not pay off toxic liabilities. I aggressively acquire them." I opened the envelope and pulled out the thick stack of secondary loan contracts. I looked directly at Jason, watching his entire fake world actively collapse in real time. Over the past 24 hours, Vanguard Equity has successfully executed a massive, highly targeted financial sweep of the secondary credit markets. I declared, ensuring every single word was captured perfectly on the live broadcast. We identified every single private loan, every single bridge financing agreement, and every single outstanding invoice your fake startup owed. We bought out the software supplier you desperately needed. We bought out the luxury leasing firm that actually owns your cars. We bought out every single aggressive private equity firm you stupidly borrowed money from. Jason's legs physically gave out. He stumbled backward and heavily collapsed against the marble security desk, his breath coming in short, rapid, terrified gasps. "You no longer owe money to a dozen scattered creditors," I stated coldly, stepping directly into his personal space, completely ignoring the camera. "Now you owe absolutely everything to me. Vanguard Equity is your sole undisputed creditor. We hold the massive debt on your company. We hold the legal titles to your cars. And because you were stupid enough to sign strict personal guarantees on all of those private loans, we now legally hold the rights to every single personal asset you and Naomi currently possess. You came here today demanding $500,000 to save your miserable life. But you are leaving with absolutely nothing because I am officially calling in all of your loans effective immediately. You are entirely, completely, and permanently bankrupt." I turned away from his broken, hyperventilating form and looked back at the reporter who was staring at me in absolute stunned silence. He slowly lowered the microphone, completely forgetting his role as an aggressive tabloid journalist. The live chat on his broadcasting monitor was flying by at blinding speeds, the public narrative instantly and violently shifting from blind outrage to absolute shock. "You can stop broadcasting now," I told him smoothly, offering a very thin, incredibly cold corporate smile. "The show is officially over. Please have your security team escort these trespassers off my property immediately." "Wait!" I commanded sharply, raising a single hand before Marcus could physically grab my hyperventilating brother. The security guards instantly froze in place. The tabloid reporter, who had just started to lower his heavy broadcasting camera in defeat, immediately hoisted it right back onto his shoulder. His journalistic instincts knew the bloodbath was not actually finished. He zoomed the lens in tight, capturing every single bead of sweat rolling down Jason's face. I looked directly at the reporter and offered a perfectly calm, icy nod. "Keep the live stream running," I instructed smoothly. "We have an audience of millions currently watching this absolute tragedy unfold, and I firmly believe in delivering a complete, uninterrupted narrative." I slowly turned my back on Jason. He was already destroyed, a completely bankrupt, legally compromised shell of a man who was about to face severe federal extortion charges. He was no longer my primary concern. I turned my full, undivided attention to the two people standing completely paralyzed in the center of the lobby, Thomas and Diane, my parents. Diane was trembling violently. Her heavily orchestrated performance from 10 minutes ago had entirely evaporated, replaced by genuine, unadulterated terror. She looked at me with wide, panicked eyes, desperately trying to process the absolute destruction of her perfect golden child. Thomas stood rigidly beside her, his face ashen, staring at the floor, as if he expected it to suddenly open up and swallow him whole. They had spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable financial asset, a secondary character meant only to support Jason and his massive ego. Now they were standing in the marble lobby of the corporate empire I built, without them, watching their entire fake reality shatter into a million jagged pieces. "Tell me, Diane," I began, my voice echoing clearly in the dead silent room. "When you went on that sensationalized local podcast yesterday and violently accused me of elder abuse, did you actually believe Jason was a victim? Did you honestly think I was just a greedy, vindictive daughter trying to crush his brilliant small business out of pure spite?" Diane opened her mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, choked gasp escaped her throat. She looked desperately at Jason, who was actively shrinking against the security desk, completely refusing to make eye contact with her. I stepped closer to my parents, my high heels clicking ominously against the polished stone floor. "I want to ask you both a very simple, highly practical question." I continued, ensuring my tone was loud enough for the microphone to pick up every single syllable. As I just clearly demonstrated to the entire internet, Jason burned through all of his fraudulent investor capital over 6 months ago. He exhausted every single shady private equity loan he could possibly secure. He was completely out of options. So how exactly did he manage to keep his fake company afloat last month? How did he magically secure the massive sudden influx of cash required to pay his overseas software suppliers just 3 weeks ago? Thomas finally looked up, his brow heavily furrowed in deep, sudden confusion. "What are you talking about, Gemma?" My father rasped, his voice sounding incredibly old and fragile. "Jason told us he secured a prestigious angel investor." I let out a short, harsh laugh that held absolutely zero humor. "An angel investor. That's beautifully poetic, Thomas. But the truth is vastly more devastating." I gestured for David to hand me the final document. My lead attorney pulled a single, heavily authenticated legal folder from his briefcase and placed it directly into my waiting hand. I did not hold it up for the camera this time. I walked directly over to my father and forced the folder against his chest until his shaking hands came up to grasp it. "Open it," I commanded softly. Thomas fumbled with the heavy paper cover. Diane leaned over his shoulder, her eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text. I watched their faces with absolute chilling detachment. I watched the exact second the catastrophic reality registered in their minds. When Jason ran out of victims to defraud, I explained to the live audience staring coldly at my parents. He realized he still had access to one final highly valuable asset, your beautiful, fully paid off retirement home in the suburbs. The house you spent 30 years paying for. The house you specifically stole my college tuition fund to renovate. Thomas let out a horrifying, agonizing groan, completely dropping the folder onto the marble floor. The authenticated documents spilled out clearly, displaying the massive, highly official bank seals. Jason didn't find an angel investor, I stated, delivering the absolute killing blow with surgical precision. 3 weeks ago, Jason and Naomi secretly forged both of your signatures. Naomi utilized her extensive, highly questionable public relations contacts to secure a fraudulent notary public stamp. They completely bypassed basic banking verification protocols and aggressively took out a massive, highly leveraged second mortgage directly against your retirement home. They stole hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure equity from you, their own parents, to pay off their luxury car leases and keep their fake business alive for one more month. Diane let out a blood-curdling scream. It was not a fake manufactured cry for the cameras. It was the visceral, terrifying sound of a woman having her entire soul ripped out of her chest. She violently turned toward Jason, her hands curling into tight, aggressive fists. "You swore to us!" she shrieked, her voice echoing wildly through the lobby. "You swore the house was protected. You said you only needed our financial profiles for a basic background check." Naomi completely broke down. The highly trained public relations director realized she was now legally implicated in massive real estate fraud on top of federal extortion. She frantically backed away from Jason, violently shaking her head. "I didn't know!" she screamed desperately to the camera, completely throwing her husband to the wolves without a second thought. "He told me it was a standard corporate loan. I never saw the mortgage papers." Jason stared at his wife, absolutely betrayed by her immediate, ruthless deflection. He frantically pushed himself off the security desk, holding his hands up in a pathetic attempt to defend himself. "Mom, please listen to me," he pleaded, his voice cracking hysterically. "It was just a temporary bridge loan. I swear to God I was going to pay it back. I just needed one more month to secure a real buyout. I was going to make us all rich. It was just a signature." "You forged our names," Thomas roared, his face turning a dangerous, volatile shade of red. "You mortgaged the only thing we have left. We are living on fixed pensions. If that loan defaults, the bank is going to foreclose. We are going to be completely homeless." "Well, Thomas," I interrupted smoothly, instantly drawing the attention of the entire room back to me. "The loan actually defaulted at 900 this morning because, as I mentioned earlier, Vanguard Equity aggressively bought up every single piece of Jason's toxic debt, including that fraudulent second mortgage." My parents froze, staring at me in absolute horrified silence. The ultimate devastating consequence of their lifelong favoritism had finally arrived. "You spent my entire life telling me that family must always stick together," I said, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "You demanded that I sacrifice my own future to protect his fragile ego. You went on the internet yesterday and called me a cutthroat corporate raider who wanted to leave her aging parents on the street. You desperately wanted a villain for your tragedy. But I didn't bankrupt you, Thomas. I didn't steal your home, Diane. Your perfect, beloved golden child did. He drained you of absolutely everything, and he did it with a smile on his face." I turned to the security guards who were standing by in stunned silence. "Marcus," I said, clearly pointing at the shattered, sobbing mess that used to be my family. "Throw them out. All of them. And if they ever step foot on my property again, have them immediately arrested for criminal trespassing." I looked at my father, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, sterile finality. "You completely misunderstand the timeline of your own ruin, Thomas," I stated clearly, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "You're begging me to stop a legal process that has already finished. Because Jason was heavily defaulting on multiple private equity loans simultaneously, the primary lender aggressively accelerated the mortgage timeline. The loan didn't just default this morning. The bank officially foreclosed on your house exactly 2 days ago." Vanguard Equity purchased the distressed property deed at a private closed-door auction yesterday afternoon. You don't have a home anymore. I own the house and I have already ordered the locks changed. I stepped back into the elevator and let the heavy glass doors seamlessly slide shut, permanently sealing off their frantic, desperate screams. As the private car rapidly ascended back to my sanctuary on the top floor, I knew the physical confrontation was finally over. But the true systemic destruction of my toxic family was only just beginning. The immediate aftermath was swift, absolute, and entirely brutal. Within the span of a single week, Jason completely lost everything he had ever falsely claimed to own. The viral live stream of our lobby confrontation had been instantly downloaded, clipped, and ruthlessly analyzed by millions of viewers across the internet. The public backlash was immediate and highly destructive. His fake startup became instantly radioactive overnight. Every single private investor, completely horrified by the undeniable proof of federal extortion and severe civil fraud, aggressively pulled their remaining financial commitments. Facing a massive mountain of defaulted debt exclusively held by Vanguard Equity, Jason was forced to officially file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The legal dismantling of his fake life was extremely public. His rented luxury office space was heavily padlocked by angry landlords. His imported sports cars were legally repossessed in the middle of the night by my aggressively organized collection teams. His entirely hollow corporate empire completely collapsed into nothingness. But the absolute harshest betrayal did not come from his massive list of angry creditors. It came directly from the woman who had happily helped him build his fragile house of cards. Naomi quickly realized that the viral broadcast had not just destroyed her husband, it had completely obliterated her entire professional reputation. The highly connected public relations director was suddenly a massive liability. Legitimate firms flatly refused to return her calls, terrified of the intense public scrutiny she now attracted. She was permanently branded across every social media platform as a complicit fraudster who eagerly exploited elderly relatives just to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle. Sensing the rapidly approaching legal storm, Naomi coldly executed a vicious, entirely self-serving exit strategy. Exactly 4 days after the disastrous lobby confrontation, Naomi immediately filed for aggressive divorce proceedings. She did not even bother to inform Jason in person. She simply had a private process server publicly hand him the thick stack of legal papers while he was standing outside a cheap suburban motel. Before filing the paperwork, she ruthlessly liquidated their joint checking accounts, rapidly draining whatever meager cash reserves they still possessed, and completely vanished from the state. By legally distancing herself from the fraudulent second mortgage on my parents' retirement home, she successfully shifted the entire burden of the heavy forgery charges directly onto his shoulders. Jason was suddenly trapped in a terrifying legal nightmare, completely isolated, entirely bankrupt, and aggressively targeted by state and federal investigators. He had spent his entire life arrogantly believing he was the untouchable golden child, deeply protected by blind parental devotion. Now he was rapidly drowning in the toxic consequences of his own actions, frantically realizing that absolutely no one was coming to save him. The harsh reality of his massive downfall heavily rippled outward, completely crushing the last remaining illusions held by my parents. Exactly 10 days after the disastrous lobby confrontation, the building concierge of my high-security luxury apartment complex called my private line. He sounded deeply uncomfortable as he explained that two desperate elderly individuals were aggressively crying in the pristine lobby, loudly demanding to see their daughter. I instructed the concierge to send them up. I stood perfectly still in the center of my massive open-concept living room, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline. I had conquered entirely on my own. When the private elevator doors opened directly into my foyer, Thomas and Diane stumbled out. They looked absolutely terrible, physically aged by an entire decade in just a few short days. They were carrying 3 cheap, bulging trash bags filled with whatever basic clothing they managed to hastily pack before my corporate legal team officially seized their property. They had completely lost their paid-off retirement home, their secure future, and the precious golden child they blindly worshipped. Jason had entirely cut contact, completely blocking their phone numbers the exact second his bankruptcy proceedings began. They had absolutely nowhere else to go. Diane instantly threw herself onto my expensive hardwood floors, hysterically weeping with genuine terror. "Gemma, please!" She sobbed loudly, desperately reaching out toward my tailored trousers. "We have absolutely nothing left. Jason entirely abandoned us to the aggressive lawyers. We are sleeping in our freezing old car. You are our only daughter. We are your own flesh and blood. You have to let us stay here with you. Just give us a small spare room. We will do absolutely anything." Thomas stood rigidly behind her, awkwardly twisting his worn hat in his shaking hands. "We know we made some terrible mistakes, Gemma," he rasped defensively, completely incapable of offering a genuine apology. "But family is family. You can't just abandon your own parents to the unforgiving streets. You have all this massive space." I looked down at the two pathetic figures who spent my entire childhood treating me like a completely unwanted burden. I felt absolutely zero pity. I felt no lingering anger. I only felt complete, absolute emotional detachment. They were no longer my parents. They were simply two desperate strangers, facing the ultimate consequences of their own toxic financial decisions. I did not offer them my hand. I did not offer them a comforting embrace. I calmly walked over to my modern glass dining table and picked up a crisp, heavily bound legal folder. I turned back and extended my hand, holding the documents out toward my father. "This is a standard, completely non-negotiable residential lease agreement," I stated clearly, my voice freezing the air between us. "I am willing to offer you a very small, deeply modest one-bedroom apartment in a lower-income building recently acquired by Vanguard Equity. The rent is exactly $2,000 a month, strictly payable on the first of every single month. Utilities are entirely separate, and a massive security deposit is absolutely required immediately upon signing." Diane stopped crying, instantly staring at the folder in absolute shock. "But we're your parents!" she gasped, completely unable to comprehend the harsh boundary. "You want us to pay you rent?" "I am a highly successful chief executive officer," I replied coldly, dropping the heavy lease agreement directly at her feet. "I do not run a free charity for people who actively try to destroy my company. You either sign that legally binding contract right now, or you leave my secure property immediately and go live in the streets. The choice is entirely yours." Thomas slowly knelt down on the hardwood floor, his aging joints popping loudly in the deafening silence of my apartment. His shaking hands reached out and picked up the heavy legal folder. He opened the cover, his eyes scanning the first page of the strict lease agreement. Suddenly his breath hitched. He blinked rapidly, bringing the thick paper closer to his face. "Gemma," he whispered, his voice trembling with a fresh wave of absolute shock. "This address. This is not a lower-income apartment building. This is our house." Diane immediately gasped, snatching the contract from his hands. She stared at the property address printed clearly at the top of the page. It was the exact suburban retirement home they had lived in for 30 years. I looked at them, my expression completely unreadable. "I lied about the cheap apartment," I stated smoothly. "I am offering you the exact home you just lost. You can return to your precious suburban neighborhood. You can sleep in your own bedroom, but you will do so as my legal tenants. Vanguard Equity owns the property outright. You will pay me fair market value, which currently sits at exactly $4,000 a month. There are absolutely no family discounts. There is no grace period for late rent. If you miss a single payment by even one day, my property management firm will aggressively initiate formal eviction proceedings, and you will be permanently removed by the local sheriff." Diane stared at me, completely horrified by the absolute inescapable karma of the situation. "You're making us rent our own home from you," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "You're going to be our landlord." "I am your sole provider," I corrected her coldly. "For 30 years you treated me like complete garbage. You prioritized Jason at every single turn, draining my college funds, ignoring my achievements, and openly discarding me when I refused to submit to your toxic demands." Now the golden child has completely abandoned you to the wolves, and the daughter you violently rejected is the only human being standing between you and the unforgiving streets. You will pay me every single month just to keep a roof over your heads. You will strictly abide by the rules set in my corporate contract, and you will finally understand the true heavy cost of your lifelong betrayal. I turned away from them, picking up my designer coat from the entryway chair. I signaled to the private security guard standing quietly by the elevator. Marcus will give you exactly 5 minutes to sign that legally binding document, I instructed calmly. If it is not signed and fully dated by the time I reach the ground floor, he will physically escort you out of the building. Do not ever call my private number again. I did not wait for their response. I stepped into the elevator, letting the glass doors slide shut permanently, severing the final decaying thread of my biological family. As the car descended, I closed my eyes. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. The crushing weight I had carried since childhood was entirely gone. 45 minutes later, I walked into a highly exclusive, dimly lit Italian restaurant in the heart of the financial district. The hostess immediately guided me to a private back table. David, my brilliant corporate attorney, and Sarah, my chief operating officer and closest confidant, were already sitting there sharing a bottle of expensive vintage wine. They both looked up as I approached, their faces breaking into warm, genuine smiles. "We've successfully secured the final signatures on the bankruptcy proceedings," David announced proudly, raising his glass in a celebratory toast. "And Marcus just confirmed the lease was heavily signed and fully executed. The nightmare is officially over, Gemma." I sat down, taking a deep breath of the rich, warm air. I looked at the two incredibly loyal, fiercely intelligent people sitting across from me. They had fought violently by my side, protected my interests, and supported me when my own blood tried to destroy me. This was my real family, not built on toxic obligation or manipulative guilt, but carefully forged through mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and shared success. We spent the entire evening laughing, sharing incredible food, and excitedly mapping out the upcoming quarterly expansion for Vanguard Equity. The dark, suffocating shadow of my past was completely eradicated, replaced by a remarkably bright, completely unburdened future. Listen to me very carefully. Society constantly pushes the extremely toxic narrative that family is absolutely everything. We are aggressively conditioned to forgive unforgivable betrayals, to endlessly tolerate extreme emotional abuse, and to blindly empty our own bank accounts just because we share genetic material with our abusers. It is a massive, highly manipulative lie designed to keep successful, driven women completely chained to the anchors dragging them down. You do not owe your success to people who actively tried to orchestrate your failure. You do not owe your hard-earned wealth to family members who view you as a disposable automatic teller machine. Knowing your true worth means having the absolute courage to ruthlessly cut dead weight, even if that weight is your own parents or siblings. You have the total power to dismantle their control, reclaim your narrative, and build a brilliant empire entirely on your own terms. Protect your peace, protect your assets, and never apologize for fiercely destroying anyone who attempts to steal what you have built. Thank you so much for following my story. If this narrative resonated with you, or if you have successfully cut out toxic family members to build your own chosen family, hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment down below sharing your own experiences with setting harsh financial boundaries. Like this video. Share it with someone who desperately needs to hear this exact message today. And always remember to never let anyone heavily discount your worth. I will see you in the next one.